No, you need to do it again. No, it's the twice. It's quick. No, you need
That could be the dumbest thing ever. Okay. So, we did DBQ on Wednesday. Does anybody not have the documents? Documents, okay. So make sure you go back and look at it. Remember, there's got to be 6 documents, or about approximately 2 per paragraph. And remember, you want to basically show how the document relates to facts you know to prove your thesis. Anybody else? No. Okay. Already ready for St. Patrick's Day. Very good. We like St. Patrick's Day in here.
Emma and I had a question. We are wondering if you believe in leprechauns and if you've ever caught them.
Huh? Well, if you can't tell people if you caught them. That's the rules.
Yeah.
So that should tell you everything you need to know. But I'm not saying I have a collection. Yes.
I sent you something that I think will understand.
So on Teams or
Yeah.
anything, I'll look. Shall I look right now?
Yes.
Yes. And
And if it's good enough, I think MC should present. Or I'll volunteer to because I think it's good.
I will look at the Germany did nothing wrong. Doesn't pop up.
That's it?
It's cool.
Yeah.
You know, so I'll have to look at it on my own phone, but I will. I don't know, is it appropriate?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to come back to the video. I did that on Friday because so many people were gone on, have almost nobody first period. And so let's go ahead and get back, let's finish up a good hunk of the war. I mean, one of the reasons I want to do this is because in World War I, you can really see what happened with total war, totalitarianism. You can really see it here. Much better than other wars because it encompasses all of it. I mean, when you start, people started lynching dogs that were like dachshunds because they're German. You know what was going on in war, and I'm not making that up. Yeah, I know, it's horrible. And so with this, we needed to see a Pleasant Valley scene before we got back to, and so let's do the U.S. entered the war. Boom. Got the Russian Revolution, all this stuff, but did we get to this at all? We got the Heaver, right? Rupert Heaver and Food Administration, War Production Board, which by the way didn't work. So, volunteer army. The assumption was all these young men would join following the cat. I like that. Yeah, I like that poster. But the assumption was everybody would join up. In fact, they'd get 2 million volunteers, and then they'd worry about the more soldiers they would need after the fact. After the first initial rush after declaration of war, only about 100,000 men volunteered. Most young men did not want to go fight and die in a trench. And this just shocked people because, as we all know, there's lice. Come on. But things like this, you know, this sheet music is really popular. Can't read it. It says, "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier." And a lot of people are like, okay, we're in the war, but why are we fighting this war? It's not. I don't care what happens with Germany. Of course, it might be more complex than that. But almost immediately what that meant is we got a draft. So Congress would pass, with President Wilson's urging, a Selective Service Act. We call that the draft. But there's a lot of anti-draft talk, almost immediately, about the draft. And remember, is anti-draft talk anger? Is that anger about, that's why I put the question mark, about a political idea to have a draft? Or are the Germans winning? Do you see the problem almost immediately? Is it pro-German? That's the thing. Is it pro-German to be opposed to the draft? To have international, the war against war, or here's it, telling people to be drafted. They did it by lottery. And then at the end of April, we'll come back to that again. Here's soldiers break up big peace meeting in Seattle. There's so many weird ways to look at that headline. Soldiers break up peace meeting. Why? They're against the draft. Wilson looked at this and, okay, Wilson was reluctant to go to war, did not want to go to war. But once he made the decision, he's all in. And he looked at it like, how dare they not understand that we're on this? And he called this all the time a glorious crusade. How can they not see that? So he thought they must be pro-German. We already have a massive pro-German element that is undermining the state, undermining the country. Anti-war people must be aided by the Germans. And there were some German spies. The Germans did try to promote anti-war feeling because they didn't want the U.S. in the war. So there's elements of truth, and that leads to this cry for social unity. Almost immediately, the Creel Commission. It's named after George Creel, who had run it. It was actually the Committee of Public Information, which literally is kind of as a direct antecedent from the French Revolution. But George Creel was a movie producer in the brand new motion picture industry, and they started producing little films like this, Under Four Flags. Theaters were literally just kind of starting. The first real motion picture was Birth of a Nation back in 1913. So watch this, these kind of cheesy pro-war movies. They did pro-war advertisements. They sent out men to give speeches. They called them 4-minute men. They come out and give a really quick speech about why we must fight the war, and why we must make the sacrifice, and don't oppose the draft. But the big thing, of course, it promoted was fear. If we don't win, the Germans will take over, or something worse. There'll be a revolution. The American way of life will be destroyed, because it was hard to actually honestly believe that the Germans will soon be invading the shores of the United States. But they had to promote, like, if the Germans do win, that will lead to something horrible within our borders. And so with that, that's going to lead to the Espionage Act, as we said before. We've already talked about this. And another law would be passed, even though that would sunset, it would disappear, called the Sedition Act. Remember the Alien and Sedition Act way back in 1798, which banned free speech completely. No criticism of the government. But the Espionage Act was the one that was enforced the most. And who were the target? Well, of course, the Germans. But the Germans, if you're targeting free speech in the United States, the Germans are actually, they're in Europe. But there's a lot of German immigrants, relatively recent immigrants. Can we really trust them? If Germany is so evil, maybe they've been planning this for years to get the Americans into the war so they could undermine us. Maybe they were sending immigrants over to the United States as a secret unit to take over as soon as the U.S. entered the war. The Germans have been planning this for a long time. Now, that is what we call patently ridiculous, but it also shows how scared people got. But there are people who say that today, that immigrants from Latin America are actually a secret cadre to overthrow the U.S. government now and go back to Mexico. People say that today all the time. And I'm not exaggerating. So, it exists today. But also, socialists. Socialists were anti-war. Workers killing workers. Why are we fighting each other when it's all for somebody else to get rich? Now, they haven't had the socialist revolution in the Soviet Union quite yet when this was beginning, but that happened in November of 1917. So these are the targets. And so I just like this poster because it shows the desire for social unity. Here we have all these individuals with different clothing, different occupations, different dreams, different hopes. And what do they turn into? And all in step, you notice? All together. Are they individuals anymore? It's no coincidence that these new ultra-right-wing fascist governments like Italy and Germany will emphasize the mass will, or as Hitler called it, das Volk. We're weak like this, and the enemy can get us. We must all be together. That's why World War I just covers so much. That's why it's such an interesting thing. And then So here's some basic posters, and I put this up there because of quasi-comical value. First off, this artist really liked this model. But secondly, this show is trying to convince young men to volunteer to join. And I think they are hilarious because they're not subtle at all. I mean, I want you. Yeah, that's not subtle at all. She will date you if you join up, which I think is really funny. I want you. I want you. Or, of course, the I wish I were a man, implying you're not a man if you don't join. Trying to get people to join up. And that played on this kind of socialized masculinity, but also it's kind of effective. But the big one was fear. We all know that. Hate all the enemies. Hate them all. Hate all the enemies that might undermine our state. Hate. They're trying to get us and destroy us and make us weak. And those 4-minute men would bash, not just on Germans, but those who don't want to fight the war because they're really with the enemy. So this really happened. But the pushing on, her ship hit by a submarine. And then here, this is 1918, and it's still using the Belgian propaganda. And it's not subtle, is it? We know exactly what it's implying right here. And so with that, we literally devolve into war madness, where one of the things about total war is they don't necessarily need, they don't necessarily need the government to arrest people. They can just simply have each citizen police themselves and look for potential enemies. And so this constant idea that there are spies everywhere, you must prove you're an American. I like the little kid holding to the hell with the Kaiser. I feel like that's the parents made that sign and are quite proud. But training them early to look for potential enemies everywhere. And look at these German atrocities, Limburger cheese or sauerkraut. So they started, for example, taking German-sounding food and changing their name. So Frankfurters became hot dogs. Hamburgers became Salisbury steak, which is another kind of a ground beef patty thing. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Dachshunds became Liberty pups. And yes, I like, but not this breed. Yeah, lots of German dog breeds were killed because of this. And people with German-sounding names were attacked on the streets. Their homes would have rocks thrown through the windows. Sometimes they would be beat up, a few times even lynched. So on my mom's side, my mom's maiden name is Schatz, German name. And my great-grandfather had a little store in Papillion, Nebraska, which was then just a tiny little town south of Omaha, Nebraska. Schatz's, just a little tiny store back. This is when chain stores weren't around yet. They're not just starting, a little neighborhood grocery store. And they had their window broke time after time after time. And a few people threw like flaming things inside to try to catch the store on fire. He was called traitor in every name in the book. No, he was obviously a very stubborn man. We'll come out of another story about him down the road next week, but he didn't change his name. But a lot of people with German names changed their name. Schmidt and Schatz and names like that became Smith and things like that because they were attacked so much. War madness. Now, it did not devolve to what happened in, let's say, the Ottoman Empire, but you can see the steps. He's attacked for nothing that he ever did, but because of his name, his ethnic background. And that happened all the time. Now, I know what you're thinking. That could never happen now, though, because we're so much smarter. But let me add one thing very important. Every generation thinks they're smarter than the previous generation. Every generation. And think this would never happen to them. And that, of course, makes them very susceptible because then they think, well, it never happened to me, so now I understand. Can't fool me. Usually they're the easiest people to fool. Yes, you will say the same thing. I'm smarter than previous generations. Now, I know mine is, but no. You know, people my generation say it all the time. And no, they're never right. We're smart about some things, we're not smart. It's just life. So, for example, right before you were born, the United States was actually getting people all fired up in the US to go to war with Iraq. For reasons that were, we know now, completely made up. Iraq has never attacked the United States. Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th. They said that they had weapons of mass destruction. They did not, and were not even close. That was purely made up. But the US went to war with them and invaded. And it was going to bring peace and prosperity to the Middle East. That worked. So everything's fine there. But that's me being facetious. But France was totally and completely opposed to this. France, one of our closest allies. We desperately wanted Western Europe to join in. And France said, no, this is stupid. There's no reason to attack. And you would not have believed in 2002, 2003 in the United States how much anti-French attitude there was. Because they would not enter a war against a country that never attacked them. It's actually kind of mind-boggling. The state of Montana divested its state fund, which is money the state of Montana invests in things like teachers' pensions, that kind of thing. Divested from French stock because of that. We'll show the French. We won't have companies like Michelin, which is a French tire company. The state of Montana lost like $14 million in 3 months because of this. But whatever. That's a little bit of war madness. But people started changing the name of the food, including the Congressional Cafeteria in the United States House of Representatives. The U.S. House voted to change the name of French toast and French fries to Freedom Toast and Freedom Fries. That's war madness. And now some of you are saying, no, that can't be real. Here's the menu. Kind of hard to see, but it says grilled cheese and Freedom Fries. That's in the congressional menu at the little cafeteria they have for members of the House and the Senate and their staff. And then to give you an idea how this still goes on, and people like make these performative things, and it becomes a thing. Here are people, because now of anger over Russia, say they will no longer have Russian mustards. What? I don't mean mustards from Russia, just Russian style. Or here's a guy dumping out vodka because it's a Russian drink, even though it's not, one of the bottles is not from Russia. That's war madness. Can it happen? Yes. There's reasons I'm telling you this. You can see so many examples of what total war does. And yes, it could potentially happen here. Not in this classroom, but out there. And so with that, we'll show you there's all these political prisoners. Thousands will be arrested nationwide, hundreds in Montana for its own espionage act. So here are 3 political prisoners arrested in Montana. And I put down this guy because I had to show you this. So Theodore Clipstein, I want to add a clipper. That's what he said, and he was arrested and sentenced to 2 to 4 years for saying that. War madness. He would serve 1.5 years till finally he was pardoned after the war was over. But still, that is what was going on. And so with that, so Germans anger, but there's a lot of anger against socialists. Socialists were intensely anti-war. There's a kind of a socialist-leaning labor union called the IWW, or the International Workers of the World. Everybody called them the Wobblies. And they were like the Knights of Labor. Remember the Knights of Labor, all workers together? This is when they're posted for one big union. Here's an anti-war wobbly poster showing a worker fertilizing the ground with money so he could get rich, but what's the only crop? Skulls. Now this poster has always bothered me, because shouldn't it be the other way around? Should you be fertilizing it with the skulls and it grows money for them? I know that's a stupid thing to bother, but every single time I see it, I got to make that comment. And all of you are going, okay, it's an anti-war poster, but it still bugs me. But here's an anti-wobbly poster. And who's this supposed to represent? What person? Kaiser, IWW. By the way, this is the symbol for the Wobblies. Wobblies, a Sabo cat. IWW. Well, what town in Montana do you suppose the Wobblies were really powerful in? Anybody want to guess? It was by far the biggest town in Montana. Click. Butte, America. Yes, Butte, 1917. So Butte was a big wobbly town. All these workers in the horrible conditions of the mine. Was it 20 miners were dying every week in the mine, or every month in the mines in Butte? Mining is so dangerous. It would get better, but it's slipping again. I mean, such an awful, tough job. I know a lot of people. My wife's grandfather, on the other side of the family, loved mining. It's just kind of funny how that happens. But Frank Little was an IWW organizer, and he went to Butte at the end of the summer of 1917, and he gave a speech against the draft and against the war. There's Frank Little right there. Little spoke to over 10,000 people, and a raucous crowd of people scared and tired of the war, even though Butte was booming because of all the demand for cotton, I'm sorry. They're mining a lot of cotton in Butte. Copper. Well, when he went back to his room, he was knocking on the door, and it's a police officer. And they let him out, and there's all these patriotic leagues that were being formed, and they saw him as a traitor and a spy. They took him, roughed him up, tied him to the back of their car, and drug him around town. And it's not sure if he was dead or not by then, but they hung him from this railway trestle. That's his funeral. They lynched him. Remember, lynching is torturing somebody to death. So he was lynched for his opposition to the war. And yes, the police of Butte was involved. Nobody was ever arrested. And on his body, that's a picture of the little piece of paper it had. And it says, others take notice. First and last warning, 3777. And that was famous in Montana for what? Yeah.
It's calling for Prohibition.
Yeah, the vigilantes of territorial Montana, which were basically a bunch of pro-Confederate thugs who were killing people who were for the Union, including our second territorial governor, Thomas Francis Meagher, whose statues in front of the Capitol. He was almost certainly murdered by vigilantes. So that's a pretty scary statement. Now, I'm going to show my bias. I don't like vigilantes. Nothing against East Helena, but I don't like vigilantes. Yes, that was their nickname, which really, but they put that on there. Yes, we have a weird, quirky thing in the state. What important representatives of the state of Montana have that on their uniform? Highway Patrol. Yeah, state police, Highway Patrol. Yeah. Some local police departments do, but all the Highway Patrol. This weird legacy of that. That's to give you an idea how violent it was. Going to 1918, as they were arresting more and more people for opposition to the war, the court case Schempp versus the United States came up against the Espionage Act. Against the Espionage Act. And there were a number of people arrested, not just Eugene Debs, the famous socialist labor leader, but also women fighting for suffrage. And this fighting for suffrage directly mentions or basically refers to the Espionage Act. It says, Mr. President, remember the Constitution. Congress should make no law abridging the freedom of speech of the press. The political prisoners who believe this guarantee are now serving 20 years in prison. A significant number of women were arrested for demanding the right to vote, as this was seen as anti-government sedition. By the way, that just said the loophole that would be used in the Schenck case. The Supreme Court said yes, speech can be limited. It is not free speech if it presents a clear and present danger. And the definition they used in the ruling was you can't go into a theater and yell fire to watch the panic because you think it'll be fun. That is not freedom of speech. So it's implying creating a mass panic is the same as being opposed to the right to vote or demanding the right to vote. It's the same thing. Now, some of you might agree, some of you might disagree, but that's a pretty big deal. And so with that, all the cases will be upheld, including many women we'll get to in just a second, but Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, would be arrested. Here he is from a federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia, and yours for president. He would get 1 million votes for president in 1920 from a prison cell. To give you an idea of how, yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't be in prison and run for president. It's a very quirky thing. And when he was tried, this is his comment he said. He said, at his trial, he said, this trial is illegitimate, this violates freedom of speech. He didn't care what this said, he said this was inappropriate. But I just like this for, says the social element, but when he's talking about here, I want to show the criminal element. He's talking about political prisoners. That's what he's talking about. Those being held because of their views and not what they did. Their views alone were dangerous to the state. And so, speaking, we had the voting thing we must refer. Okay, so women. Remember, Montana, women could vote in 1914, but most places couldn't. Now, many women, about 20% of women were in the workplace. And I'm not counting, of course, people on farms, because if you know anything about farms, everybody works their tail off, male or female. But it was always assumed that those who did enter the workplace to replace men, they call it man's jobs, they're going to give up the job when the war's over. They're going to go back to whatever they were doing before, either lower paid jobs or back home. Remember, they have these new nice appliances, electrical appliances, now to clean home. And with that, here shows the various women who took over jobs that were supposedly for men. But women, many women, not all, were demanding the right to vote. President Wilson promised and did not deliver. And when the war began, he said, we can't worry about that now. We have the war to fight. And many women brought the very good point. If we're fighting for democracy, we don't have democracy here. Here, it says, have you forgotten your sympathy for poor Germans because they are not self-governed, meaning the right to vote? 20 million American women are not self-governed either. They do not have the right to vote. And right there is Alice Paul. And there'd be no more important leader of the suffrage movement than Alice Paul. She went to Britain and learned from what they call the suffragettes in England, and learned that direct action, that's what you have to write down, direct action is necessary. They're going to have to force politicians to vote, because they won't change unless they're forced. Direct action. Now, of course, that does not mean violent, but that also means standing out in front of the White House with signs that will embarrass the president and those who promised the right to vote. And so during the war, finally, Congress would pass what's going to become the 19th Amendment. Let's start calling the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. For whatever reason, that's gone out of fashion. Susan B. Anthony was inconsistent on some ways, but a tireless fighter for, well, the right to vote, at least white women. And they that was finally passed through Congress, and then all through 1919, it had to get the 3/4 of states necessary. Southern states were very much opposed. Montana, right away, Montana allowed women to vote in 1914. And finally, Tennessee was the last state. But part of the reason it passed Congress is because what happened to women like Alice Paul? When they were protesting the right to vote and bringing up what the government and Wilson had promised, they were arrested under both the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. And they would become political prisoners. And there's Paul in prison right there. She would stitch a flag and put a star on for every state when they ratified the amendment. And she started that in prison. And she not only would be in prison, she went on a hunger strike at the end of 1918 while it was still being debated in the House. And to get her to quit the hunger strike, they force fed her. Now, I got to be clear about it. Force feeding isn't like, oh, we got to help her, she might die. No, force feeding is torture. It's hard to see in that picture, but that is a drawing of it, because you can imagine we're not going to have cameras in here. But they take a steel tube that's shaped like this, and they would jam it down their nose. And the process of jamming down their nose, they would just rip apart the nose, break the sinus bones in there. It's such a tiny, thin little bones. Get it into the throat, and then they would dump kind of an egg and milk mixture down the tube. And they would gag, and it would be like drowning. It was torture. And if they didn't drown or have a heart attack, that would at least maybe keep them alive. But the whole point was, end it. Telling no one else, don't do your hunger strike, shut up and take it. And she refused. In fact, right after she got released from prison, this is her right after. I don't know if, I don't think I have that kind of courage. In fact, I don't think I do. I know I don't. And they forced them to act. And so that's how women got the right to vote. It was not easy. And so with that, while this is going on, there was a fight for prohibition. There's that temperance movement that had grown into maybe we could make a grand experiment to get rid of the curses of alcohol. Well, then you see this back soldiers or back booze, or like booze is somehow helping the German war effort. This became a wartime measure. Why are we wasting all this grain and corn for alcohol when they could be used for the troops and the horses and everything else at the front? So these first prohibition measures were a wartime measure. And that would lead into Congress in 1918 starting the process of passing what became known as the 18th Amendment. And in 1919, it would pass the states, allowing for the banning of alcohol. Some alcohol would be allowed, but Congress would pass the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act enforced it. Add one thing, they enforced it through taxation. Congress, the US government does not necessarily have taxing power within the states. States had to enforce it, but the federal government couldn't, but the federal government can afford taxes. They can enforce taxes. So they put 1,000% tax on the sale of alcohol. So if you sell $1 worth of alcohol, you had to pay $10 in tax. You see how the tax works? No one could survive. And then they could send treasury agents out to enforce the taxes. Those treasury agents would eventually become the FBI in the 1930s. At the same time, what we call the Spanish flu, even though that's totally unfair, but that's what it'll be dubbed in the history books. This influenza, sometimes you see called the swine flu or other things. The Spanish flu, this horrific pandemic spread the world in 1918, 1919, 1920. At least 675,000 Americans died, and mostly young people. We don't know how many people worldwide, but it's people traveling all throughout the world because of increased transportation and men moving off by the war. 60,000 American soldiers died in the trenches. It affected young people more than older people. I mean young, I mean like 10 to 40. Because their defenses would pick up so fast. When they would contract the disease, their body would react so hard that they would go into shock and kill them. Young people were the ones who were dying, especially 18 to 30, just most of them. And even though you might see a lot of younger people. So I just remember when I was going to last summer, so going to the cemetery in Phillipsburg with my wife. And how many people, it's 1919 and 1918, are in that cemetery. It's mind-boggling. Start walking through it, like actually paying attention. And so, ironically, the Spanish flu began in Kansas, almost certainly. They said Spain because nobody at war wanted to admit what was happening. So they kept it secret because they didn't want their enemies to know. And so the first publicized cases were from Spain. That's what they call the Spanish flu. It probably began in training facilities for this new army in Kansas. They set up these really quick, hasty camps. They literally called them concentration camps. I know that sounds weird to our ears, but that's what they called them then. These camps to train soldiers, and it began there, almost certainly. and then spread to Philadelphia because that was a big debarkation point for the troops. So here's the Philadelphia Navy Yard. I like the don't spit. Here, wearing masks. Wear a mask. They knew about masks for 50 years. Here, buy Horlicks malted milk because it won't have the flu. Okay, I found that a funny, creepy advertising campaign. But it spread throughout the world. There were 3 big waves. It's not the same as this. This was influenza. And now it is a flu. The pandemic we're in now, and I am not wearing a mask because the cases are so low, but they're closing down cities in China now, including Shanghai, a city of 25 million right now. It's like this curse that goes on. And yes, but that means they're not producing goods. That means prices are going to go up even more. I know it's so boring when I was your age. You guys get all the fun. I'm sorry. I actually very much like this. Wow. But this shows how it spread in 1918. Please switch. Yeah. Philadelphia's first time all on the coast and then spread so quickly. That's a mass grave in Philadelphia. So many soldiers died. Had to bury it as quick as possible. And yes, we have that here in this pandemic. And a couple more things. He's being arrested for not wearing his mask. 3 shot in struggle over mask slacker. If you thought the anti-mask thing and that was like something that only happened now, once again, every generation has things like this. Anti-mask league organized. It happens again. So all this stuff going on, we got to get to the 14 points. Because when the flu was just beginning, President Wilson laid out his plan for peace. And it was going to be this. I am so dreading the meeting. That's on film. So don't write them all down. Just put down 14 points. And 14 points became bigger than what it actually was. No one actually read the 14 points, but they knew the main elements. That this war, as awful as it was, can be for something better. We can make a better world. And President Wilson came to represent that idea, for good or bad. So the basic elements you do need to know. It was for arms reduction, open diplomacy, no more secret agreements about who or what is going into war. Secret agreements that are going to blow up in people's faces after the war. And self-determination. We'll let people decide their own fate. But then Wilson was hoping for something that had been talked about by people who are more, they would call these, in foreign policy terms, more liberal. A League of Nations where countries could come together and stop problems before they blew up into world war. They have to have some teeth, and I'll talk about that in a sec, or talk about that tomorrow. But here's the thing. This was mostly symbolic. It came to represent this idea for this better world, but it didn't really address all the problems. It said some things that are important, but more than anything, it was just like the 14 points will have a better world. When Germany quit the war, they thought they were quitting on the 14 points. And nobody was really sure what they were. In fact, Wilson would change them 3 times. And the other thing was, it was also very naive. You think the Allies, like Britain, are going to let their colonies have self-determination? Like France is going to let them have self-determination? They want more colonies. Or for that matter, it says Poland will be a country. Where? Yes, there's a lot of Poles live here, but there's a lot of Germans who live here. Ukrainians, Austrians, Romanians, Transylvanians, a massive population of Jews. Are they going to get their own country too? Nobody really knew what it meant. It implied something. In practice, would be much more complex. So the colonies in Central Europe are still wide open. And the U.S. Army is not ready at all. Slowly but surely, over the summer, the American Expeditionary Force was being created. It's going to be commanded by General John Pershing. That picture of Pershing right there, that's him on horseback chasing Pancho Villa in 1917. U.S. soldiers are going to be nicknamed doughboys. Nobody's really sure how the nickname came about, but World War I would be doughboy. You see in World War II a little bit, but since they're all draftees in World War II, they call it government issue. You hear GIs or GI Joe, just generic in World War II. So tomorrow, the war went very quickly. We'll do the treaty. Please read those documents. I would like for all of you to have a good day.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. So you never did catch it, but were you able to get the stuff online? Were you able to check the email? And I got all the class, all the notes out there, they're up on. Okay. You didn't look at that. Why not? You're responsible for it, okay?
Yeah.
You got, but I'm glad you didn't catch it, but okay, we'll see you.
Don't forget to look at what I said.
I will. I'm gonna do it right now on my phone. I didn't collect it. It's just notes. Did you like the video?
Yeah.
Were you able to get all the questions? Good. Did you like it?
I thought it was definitely disturbing, but
Yeah, I think they did a great job with it. I agree. So you looked at what you sent me, I should. Here we go.
Yeah?
no.
Was it under the sea?
I'll look at it.
What was the theme?
No, it was each, oh, okay, so it's flat each and
Okay, so I saw people wear stuff with oceans, and I was like,
yeah, it was
No, we're gonna. Not right now. We didn't finish video class, so we're gonna for about 40 minutes, and we're gonna do a few notes and come back to that last part. Sound good? Right.
yeah, get there too, yeah.
I'll just sit right here. Please. I won't mind.
This could be the dumb